Bom dia a todos, bom dia a todas. Obrigado pela presença, que vai se avolumando aqui entre os participantes para este evento de hoje à tarde. Eu queria começar agradecendo a parceria com o Conselho Empresarial Brasil-China, aqui muito bem representado pela Cláudia Trevisan, que é a sua diretora executiva. Cláudia, obrigado pela parceria e obrigado por dividir aqui esse prazer dessa conversa aqui and now I'll turn to English, right? With two of the most distinguished scholars and experts on China-U.S. relations, David Shambaugh and Lanxin Xiang. The two of them have been on prior occasions with us, but separately, never together. So this is the first time ever that we have the two of you, this opportunity to promote a dialogue between the two of you on I mean, I wouldn't elaborate more because it would be absolutely unnecessary to elaborate more on the importance of U.S.-China relations in shaping the global order that is still in the making. And it's timely fashion for a reason that will be mentioned by Cláudia Trevisan in a few seconds, and also because we are living through crucial moments in geopolitical terms because of the tensions mounting between Ukraine, Russia, Europe, and the United States. And we had no idea whatsoever when we first planned this dialogue that we will be living through such critical moments. So one more reason to be very appreciative of the two of you making the time to be here with us today. Without further ado, before turning the mic to you, Cláudia, let me just show for a few seconds and to thank the companies that sponsor the annual program of seminars of our foundation, the Fundação FHC Cardoso. I would like to thank each and every one of them for the indispensable support that they give us. Thank you so much. Now, all right. Cláudia, why don't you introduce our two guest speakers and say a few words, and then we turn the floor to David and Lanxin.
Hi Sergio. Hi David. Hi Lanxin. It's a pleasure to be with you here. I saw David many years ago in Beijing, and Lanxin is the first time I meet you, and it's a great honor and pleasure. Well, I think both our Professor Shambaugh has written more than 30 books about China. He's a professor of the George Washington University in Washington, and is considered one of the foremost specialists in China in the United States, and certainly in the world. And Professor Lanxin Xiang, he's right now as a visitor professor at the George Washington University. He was based in Switzerland until very recently. He is a profound connoisseur of the political and philosophical traditions of China, and also has a view to the world affairs. And one of his most recent books is a book about the roots, the differences on legitimacy in Western and Chinese political systems. And it's a pleasure to organize this event together with Fundação FHC Cardoso. And as Sergio said, it's a very timely discussion. Today marks the 50th anniversary of the visit of President Richard Nixon to China, which was the first step to the process of engagement that lasts for decades. And we are going to listen to both of your views about what happened with this process and is the stage of the relationship now. And I think we are going to start with brief opening remarks from David and Lanxin, and then we begin a Q&A session, me and Sergio, and then we open to questions from the audience. We ask you to please send your questions to the Q&A tool. David, floor is yours.
David, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Claudia and Sergio, very much for the invitation and the introduction. It's nice to be back in Sao Paulo, even virtually. But I've had a number of previous visits to the Fernando Henrique Cardoso Fundação and the co-sponsor of the China-Brazil Business Council. So this is not my first time. I've enjoyed every one of them previously, I have to say. I remember them vividly and look forward to future visits in person, not virtually. Hopefully we're coming to an end of this pandemic, and we'll be able to travel again. And I'd love to get back to Rio and Brasilia and Sao Paulo again. So I want to keep my opening comments brief, as we have a lot of time. We want to leave as much time as possible for discussion and the very good questions that Claudia has prepared for us. And I very much look forward to the conversation that Lanxin, who's also a longtime friend and colleague of many decades, and I will have today. But thanks, Claudia, for mentioning the ironic fact that today literally is the 50th anniversary of President Nixon's arrival in Beijing. That, of course, opened not just US-China relations, but in many ways helped to open China's reemergence into the international community. It's hard to believe that half a century has passed. I remember myself, I was 19 years old, and I, like many Americans, watched it on live television, and we were just fascinated. It was our first visual glimpse inside the People's Republic of China after the ping pong delegation, which had gone a few months previous. So I had very vivid memories of that, and to some extent it helped pique my curiosity about China, and it helped to sort of lead me into Chinese and Asian studies. I was just beginning my university years, and as a result of that, and then a subsequent gap year, I guess we call it, where I traveled to Asia, I decided to focus my career on Chinese studies. So here I am, half a century later. But, you know, looking back on the Nixon visit and the time that has elapsed since, 50 years, if there's been one distinguishing characteristic of US-China relations during this long period of time, it's one of fluctuation. The relationship has been anything but steady. It has not been steady. It has been highly fluctuant over 50 years. It has fluctuated from amity to enmity, from cooperation to competition, from friendship to hostility, from trust to deep suspicions, from shared interest to divergent interests, from lack of connections between our two societies to quite deep interactions among our peoples, and even to partial decoupling. So, you know, both sides have gone through cycles, you might say, of attraction and curiosity about the other. And that has given way to other cycles of suspicions and disillusionment. Right now, we are in a period of suspicions and disillusionment. But we've seen these cycles before. They're repetitive. And so no cycle, either the more cooperative, friendly one or the more suspicious, competitive one, is permanent. As I say, the characteristic over 5 decades has been fluctuation. So we should not assume necessarily that the current period, of which I'm going to discuss in a second, is necessarily permanent, but it does have some features that I think we have to take very seriously. So generally speaking, while the relationship has definitely grown in almost all respects, nonetheless, 50 years later, we find ourselves at the lowest, probably the lowest point ever in those 50 years, with the one exception of the post-Tiananmen massacre period from 1989 to 92. 3-year period was really very, very stressed. We're not, in my view, at that point today, but we are at the lowest point that we've been certainly since then, since 1989 to 92. Today, if you look at public opinion polls in this country, 89% of the American people now see China as either a rival or an enemy. And while we don't have similar, empirical polling in China, it is clear from social media, from official media, from Weibo and other sources that the Chinese people are equally suspicious, if not hostile, to the United States as well. So you have a parallel, you might say, very negative set of mutual perceptions of the other. The relationship has really eroded significantly in recent years. It's not broken completely, and I don't think we should consider it to be, but it is extremely stressed and it is fractured. In virtually every sector that one examines, you find differences, deep differences in politics and political systems, in ideologies, in commercial behavior, in human rights, in academic exchanges, in what's now called influence operations, in technology and innovation, in the military and security domain, concerning Hong Kong, Taiwan, Tibet, Xinjiang, the broad Indo-Pacific region, even and other regions. Competition between the United States and China is intensified in Europe, and it is intensified here in South America, in the Western Hemisphere. So competition is the term that, at least here in Washington, the United States, we are using to define the relationship. Comprehensive competition across all of these domains that I just mentioned. And this is the terminology, the narrative that the Biden administration, and indeed the Trump administration before it, has used. The Trump administration called it strategic competition. The Biden administration has yet to settle on exactly their term. President Biden himself has used the term extreme competition. Other officials of the Biden administration have used different adjectives in front of the word competition. Most recently, in the newly released Indo-Pacific strategy document that was released last week, the key sentence in there is that the competition must be managed responsibly. So competition is the terminology, that's the narrative, that's the intellectual framework in which we Americans see our relationship with China today. Now, should we all be worried about the trajectory of relations between the US and China? Absolutely, yes, we should be. It's the most important relationship in the world, I think it can be said. And it is, as I say, a very stressed relationship, and it's having collateral impacts on many, many other countries, including Brazil and those in this hemisphere. So it is really the overriding geostrategic feature of international affairs in the world today. It's the new normal. The competition is deep, it's systemic, and it's not going to change. It's indefinite. So get used to it, everybody. If you think that we're going to get back to a world of harmonious cooperation between Beijing and Washington, I would caution you to not expect that. That's not going to happen. But having said that, you know what? This competition has to be managed. It has to be managed, as the Biden administration says in its new Indo-Pacific policy document, has to be managed responsibly. We have to be adults. Beijing and Washington have to be adults and manage a very fractured relationship. I like to call it a broken marriage, but one where divorce is not an option. Okay, you got to learn to get along with and live with the partner, and because you can't just decide that, well, we've had a nice marriage and we're going to go our own separate ways now. You know, we can't go into counseling. There is no counseling for big countries like this. You can't separate. The United States and China are joined together and will remain so. So they have to learn to live with and manage and compartmentalize their frictions and work on areas of cooperation that do exist: non-proliferation, climate change, a few others, but not many. The list of things where we disagree is long. The list of things where we agree is very short. But we need to erect a number of guardrails and buffers, we would say in English, to bound the competition. I'm in favor of one kind of containment, to contain the competition so that it does not bleed into a fully adversarial relationship, because a fully adversarial relationship will be really destabilizing and can actually lead to war between the two countries. And we don't need that. Nobody needs that. So we have to be adults and we have to learn how to manage a very stressed, broken relationship. So I wish I could be more optimistic 50 years after President Nixon arrived in China. There was so much anticipation and positivity and expectations of the US-China relationship then. And we've gone, as I say, through a very fluctuant 5 decades. And here we are, we find ourselves 50 years later in a pretty bad place, I have to say. So that's just my opening comments. I wish I could be more optimistic, but I'll stop there and we can probe these topics more in the question and answer period. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, David. Now it's your turn, Lanxin. The floor is yours. Your mic is off. Now it's on.
Okay. Yes. Thank you very much. I really appreciate what David said. Well, I agree with him in general. That is to say, the situation is severe. We haven't seen that for a long time. I must say, being a student in the United States for quite many years and also work in the States, I used to think I would never see this day. I thought that this relationship, I would not see people talking about war with China, US and China in my lifetime. Maybe in the future, I don't know. But now we are seeing that. So I would be even more pessimistic than David's thinking about this relationship for at least 2 reasons. One is that the way of communication is pretty much broken. There is a, well, I put it this way, in Chinese language, they will say, when you have a situation, chicken talk to ducks, there is nothing in common. They consistently talking past each other for quite a few years now. Now, when they say one thing, even one concept, there is very little in common. For example, we talk about just the guardrail as a new concept. That's the only new concept I see coming from the Biden team since they come to power. Supposed to be something, keep you not slipping down, both of you. But then from a Chinese point of view, of course, we love to have a guardrail, but Chinese would argue, what material the guardrail is supposed to be? Who decide which height of that guardrail be? It's your standard, basically. That's what Chinese elite would say. When you use the term guardrail to prevent the crisis, but the guardrail must be built according to your standard. So it's still the same logic. It's a highway, or what's it say? It's my way or the highway. If you don't follow my value system, there's nothing we can talk about. So Chinese so far, that's my sense about it, including the military, has very little real enthusiasm on that concept of guardrail. Now, having said that, I'm not saying they are not interested in military to military conversation. That's another issue here. But just the standard, how do we determine? Okay, because once you do this according to the US value system, what they say is the rules on the road, or universal value, to put it another way. There is very little they can talk, okay, these days. The second thing also related to this value issue is that probably, I'm a historian, basically. I'm writing a lot of books which are about history. I wrote a book on Boxer Rebellion and many others. My historical sense is this: maybe this is a historic moment when Chinese began to realize 400 years, if you're not more than that, of Western or the European civilization-led hegemonic role is about to be over. Okay, this is not just the issue of a pure power, because power question is an obsession for mainly Anglo-Saxon world in particular. They love this thing. They use the mechanical calculations about rise and fall, great powers. Remember, this is the tradition starting with Edward Gibbon, well, followed by many others in English language world. They love to talk about rise and the fall of great powers. But that's not the case here. It's not just a pure power issue. It is a question of ideology, value system. The Chinese began to realize their traditional system, which lasted for that long in history, may have contributed a great deal to China's success in the past 50 or 40 years in their economic development, in their other achievements, not a very simplistic, for the very simplistic reason that because Chinese embraced Western value. You see, this is where another point of departure here. Americans say, why we start the problem with China? Because we assume, that's the logic, including by the administration, we assume their political system will follow up to their economic market economy, okay, a so-called convergence theory that has been guiding American thinking for so long. You have a lot of argument there, including Robert Zoellick and so on, saying we are disappointed because we see your economy, you embrace partially our value system, which is opening up a market economy, but you did not follow the political path we designed for you. But that's, of course, it's revisionism. I'll say instant revisionism of history. Deng Xiaoping never really said that. People tend to forget history. That's the problem. Deng Xiaoping at the very beginning said we want to do perestroika, but not glasnost. Now, Deng Xiaoping did say maybe at the end of our economic success, some political change is possible, which of course makes Deng Xiaoping's thinking quite different from the current leadership. Okay? Which I agree with David on that. He wrote quite a good book on that a few years ago, even though triggered some controversy. I don't disagree with that. But to imagine Chinese made a promise, we're going to do this, then you did not honor that logic is not there. Okay. You trip on something you created. You trip on your own imagination, basically. Then you said we're disappointed. So that is something I found ahistorical, makes no sense, and even dangerous. So that relate to the more specific issues. What I'm worried about is the prospect of war. Okay. Henry Kissinger's last year or 2 years ago said we are on the foothill of Cold War. Now, just a year later, it seemed moving way beyond that. There is no question we are in the Cold War. That's at least it's my sense of it. Maybe not the peak of the Cold War. We are in there. We are in the Cold War without George F. Kennan. That on the American side, that is very, very, very risky business. Okay. There are two attempts to try to write something called the Long Telegram in this town. but nothing really. In other words, there is no real long-term strategy I have seen on the American side. We are engaging in the Cold War. That's one thing. Second thing is the Taiwan issue and the Hong Kong and the other issues. Again, I think it's almost impossible for a common understanding there. Okay. Hong Kong question, I don't need to repeat. I've been arguing in many, many places. I wrote one of the longest essay in 1993, criticized Chris Patton. Today, of course, there is also instant revisionist history about colonial Hong Kong history. And the British had 150 years of the chance to do democracy. They never did. Then they say we're defending democracy. That, of course, it's absurd. So Taiwan, I think everybody knows what the problem is. So I think we are in a situation, as Kissinger most recently said, 1914, okay? Closer to 1914, where the great powers on the verge of misreading each other in a major way. Are we going to have an accident? Yes, we probably will have. That accident maybe escalate into a quite bigger scale of a military confrontation or not. I hope not. So this is what my concern really is. Okay, I stop here. Sorry.
Thank you for your gloomy but very interesting presentation. I'll turn it to you, Claudia, so that we can start the Q&A.
Okay, thank you both for terrific presentations. And I think, although David mentioned the fluctuations of the relationship, but I think it's clear today that the period of engagement that characterized most of the last 5 decades is over and gave place to this comprehensive competition. And in the United States, especially on the right wing of the political spectrum, there is criticism towards the policy of engagement. China is today the second largest economy in the world, and they attribute this fact in great deal to the policy of engagement. Could you both tell what each side expected to get from engagement? And now that it's over, what it would write on its obituary? And was it a mistake? David.
Oh, goodness. Well, that's a good question to begin our conversation with, Claudia. I think it's the right place because Nixon went to China in search of, you might say, engagement. And by the way, the term engagement only came into the vocabulary in the United States concerning China during the Clinton administration. That's when they adopted the so-called policy of engagement. But we now use that term to generally describe the policy from Nixon to Trump. 7 consecutive American administrations followed a policy of engagement until Trump came along. So you ask, what did the Americans expect out of engagement? 2 or 3 things I'd say. First was, and you can go back to Nixon's own essay in the magazine Foreign Affairs in 1967. He spoke of bringing China into the world community. Let's remember where China was in 1972. It was an isolated, poor, socialist, impoverished, totalitarian country, completely isolated. It has no friends. It had enemies with the Soviet Union. It had enemies with all of its Asian neighbors. It had no relations in Latin America at all. It had no relations in Europe, had no relations anywhere. Its best friend was Albania. So Nixon's vision was that 1/5 of humanity could not be left outside the community and family of nations. He said it in exactly those words, I think, in his Foreign Affairs article in 1967. We often think back about the Nixon visit to China as being motivated only by a common opposition to the Soviet Union, which, yes, the United States and China shared at the time. That was a central motivation, but it wasn't the only motivation. From Nixon's visit and till Trump, engagement was the motivation. Okay, so the first element of engagement was to bring China into the post-World War II international community, what today we call the liberal international order. And so that China could contribute to that community. 1/5 of humankind could not be left outside of the international community. China had much to contribute, and China could benefit from joining that community. So I would say that's the first element of the American thinking of engagement. And Robert Zoellick, he spoke about the bringing China in as a responsible international stakeholder. You can go back and read speeches by Bush Sr., Bush Jr., Obama. Every American president believed in bringing China out of its insular, angry, destabilizing persona to make it a member appropriately and a partner and a neighbor in the international community and in the Asia Pacific region too. So that's the first thing Americans expected and wanted. And I would say here we are 50 years later, answer, mission accomplished, okay? China's in the international arena. It's contributing a great deal. In fact, I would go so far as to say under Xi Jinping, it has really increased its game in what we call global governance. This is the only thing I give Xi Jinping credit for in his foreign policy is increased contributions to global governance. Otherwise, I think he's very destabilizing. But so that's the first thing. Americans want to bring China into the international order, shape it, yes, to contribute to the existing international order, not to undermine or overthrow that order. Second element of engagement was aimed at China domestically to, you might say, change China. Yes, that's exactly what the Americans have been trying to do for the last 50 years. To get China out of its totalitarian, insular, socialist shell, make it a more liberal economy that's integrated into the world economic system, to liberalize its domestic political system. And there, mixed results. If you compare it to where the Chinese political system was when Nixon arrived, the totalitarianism under the despot Mao, compared to today, China is a much more open political system than it was 50 years ago. However, under Xi Jinping in particular, in the last 10 years, we've seen a real retrogression, a repressive retrogression. China is the most repressive it's been now since the aftermath of the June 4th massacre in 1989 that we spoke about earlier. So mixed picture there. If you compare it to 1972, yes, China's political system is much more responsive, institutionalized, participatory, and open. But if you look at it compared to the international community today, other than North Korea and Saudi Arabia, it is the most repressive society on the planet, I would submit. So that part of engagement, the political part, hasn't really worked out fully from the American perspective. Socially, the Americans wanted to engage with China so the Chinese could come out of their country physically, go elsewhere in the world, go to Brazil, go to America, go to Europe, go everywhere, study abroad. Lanxin was a student in Shanghai, at that time, but he went to the United States and got his PhD, and then he's just spent his entire professional career teaching and working in Switzerland. That was what the Americans were thinking, get the Chinese out of China. And so they can learn things about the world and then take those ideas back to China. So that was a goal. It was a very conscious goal, and particularly to train students. And we have 376,000 Chinese students here in the United States today. So that part of the mission is still ongoing. We have many millions of Chinese who have emigrated from China to the United States. Many have become citizens of the United States and many other countries, including Brazil. They are contributing to the lives and economies and societies of many other countries. We've seen just in the Olympics an interesting phenomenon of Chinese who reside in other countries now participating for the Chinese Olympic team. That's a very interesting kind of demonstration of this globalization, you might say, social globalization. So that was a goal of engagement for the Americans. And then the last element I would say was that as China emerged into the international community and its Asian neighborhood, that it would do so in a stabilizing fashion, not a destabilizing fashion. Everybody accepted that the Chinese military was going to get stronger. We knew that. The question is, what would they do with their military? What would they do with their claims to other territories around their borders, which they claim to be their own? You know, what kind of security actor was China going to be? Well, the Americans wanted China to be part of the existing order, not an ally. No, Americans never dreamed of China being an ally of the United States, but for many decades, for a couple of decades at least, the Americans wanted China to be a strategic partner as well. So when you ask us Americans about engagement, we wanted to affect China's internal social trajectory, political trajectory, economic trajectory, and then outside of China, we wanted to affect its strategic military trajectory and its participation in international institutions. So yes, the Americans had an agenda. We didn't just walk into this relationship with China and say, oh, gee, let's go where it goes. Let's see where it goes. No, the Americans had a strategy. And here we are 50 years later. You know, I would say I'm a professor, so I would give the Americans a B. You know, but basically speaking, the strategy of engagement has worked. The only major area where it has not worked is China's domestic political system.
Lanxin.
Well, yes, I think David already touched upon the fundamental issue. So changing China's political system has been an imagination. It didn't work, therefore, the enormous disappointment. Now, here, I would also add one more thing here. That is a question of relative decline. Has played extraordinary role in American psychology, also played very important role to a headstrong Chinese leadership's behavior. So both. Now, the question is this: the Biden administration, starting with Trump, but Biden administration in particular, seem to have some kind of obsession with the question of decline, to the extent that making Chinese leaders feel they are even more powerful than they really are. That is my perception. Okay, as a Chinese citizen, as a Chinese, think tanker, because I'm running a think tank in Shanghai. I'm dealing with a lot of Chinese elite. Chinese seem to have a certain sense of schadenfreude, basically saying, well, I mean, everything's wrong in the United States. It's blamed on China. Highway 95, the dilapidated Highway 95, I used to love it when I was a student 30 or 40 years ago. Now it's the China problem. Chinese eating our lunch, as they say. Biden has almost obsessed. Everything's wrong, mentioning China. Now, China is not that powerful to begin with. So there is a kind of hysterical sense about its own relative decline. But on Chinese side, I must say, there is last 10 years at least, there is a growing sense. They are not sure at the beginning. Eventually, they seem to be more and more certain that the West is in decline. The East is rising. Now here, broadly speaking, of course, fit into my the argument about this. That's my new book, 2019 book on legitimacy, talking all about. Maybe it's time we should go back to 400 years ago, restart a cultural conversation, start by the Jesuits. Okay. Because that is a healthy conversation to begin with. Today's conversation between China and the West, the United States, is fundamentally based on post-Enlightenment theology of liberal democracy. Okay. So it's not possible, from my perspective today, to continue that tutelage on China. The West has been quite successful at doing that. I'm not talking about PRC, I'm talking about even before. After the Manchu dynasty collapsed, we chose a political system called the Republic. We chose a system modeled after the United States, basically, 1911. So we have a lot of learning. We want to learn, we want to copy something from the West. But history seemed to have proved that copying things, transplant another political system onto China will never work. This is a new awakening. So let's go back to the Jesuits, what the Jesuits talking about at the time. This is where the things are not working, okay? Because the United States is the last defense line of European enlightenment. Even Europeans, to some extent, moving beyond that. That's reflected by European Union. They are postmodern, as Robert Cooper used to say. United States, China stay with modernity, but the Europeans are moving into somehow in the postmodern conditions. So China and EU relationship will, in my view, become increasingly more important, despite all the problem disputes, on many issues. They can start some conversation. With the United States today, I really do not see any way they can talk on almost everything. Climate change, not even climate change. I hate to say it, trade or anything else. So it is a tragic situation for me. For the first time, US and China, it's different from they're not talking to each other. That's the difference. After Korean War, we didn't talk to each other. That's, the fluctuation, of course, is a long history. China-US relation always like a swing, of the pendulum. But this time we are talking, we are engaging, to use David's term, but they are not talking the same thing at all. That is the danger for me. Okay, thank you.
Sérgio, seu microfone está mudo, Sérgio.
All right, let me add another player to the game, which is Russia. As you will remember, I mean, it was one of the key drivers of the rapprochement between China and the US back 50 years ago, was the strategy by the United States to put an edge between and the socialist bloc, right? And to establish a partnership with China and sort of isolate or set to the margins the then Soviet Union. Today, the dynamic is entirely different. And so I would like to know from both of you first to, and by the way, Paulo Roberto Almeida has asked that question in the chat. And this one goes to Lanxin. How solid do you think is China-Russia partnership in the long run?
I think in the long run, I think it looks like more solid than it appears, actually. I used to be the skeptic about this relationship, but the last, I would say, 5 years, with my deeper engagement with the Russian side, I'm a council member for Vitek Club, so I go to see Putin twice a year, listen to him in private. At many chances, I talk to Russian elite. I increasingly began to realize that the relationship is far more solid than appears for very simple reason. Actually, it's not even complicated reason. The only superpower left in the world managed to alienate both at the same time. You're talking about historically, I always say, when I give lecture to the Russians, I say Sino-Russian relationship as at the peak, okay? Then I would add, since Catherine the Great. Now, Russians understood my joke here because they never get along throughout history. We even have alliance now. David talked about alliance. We do have alliance with the Russians in the 50s. We end up war. You can see how Chinese cannot deal with alliance, or Chinese can. In the West, alliance is considered assets. The Chinese think it's a liability to begin with. You have to manage alliance. Bilateral is difficult enough, not to mention multilateral. Think about US, Japan, and South Korea. So that's another issue here. The issue is there will be no chance of alliance, but there will be a very strong convergence of the national interests with each other, not just economic side. Economic side is clear. It's always compatible relationship. Okay, they sell things we need badly. We sell things they need badly. Except Russians are unhappy. They don't like this concept of compatibility of trade because they sell raw materials and weapons mostly. We sell manufactured, products, which makes them look bad. But in the geopolitical terms, as long as the current Cold War situation between both Russia, maybe even a hot one with Russia, continues, or with China, the Taiwan issue and everything else, the relationship is on much, much solid ground, but will never be an alliance. They don't need alliance. Militarily, what they need to do is only to match, as they say, SISTO and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. That's the new idea. The Russians tossed out some years ago, Chinese, even that hesitating with the Russian arrangement, the security arrangement of the former Soviet Republic, to somehow militarily linking with a Shanghai Cooperation Organization. That's the most recent idea. We can see the Kazakhstan, the recent development. Many in the West believe that Russia and China will have a crack over that. That is fundamental misreading of the situation. On Kazakhstan, they are actually compatible. Let Russian take care of the security issue. Chinese focus on economy. There is no crack. Okay, I stop here.
Your turn. What's your take on that? To be more specific, is the U.S. ready to deal with this challenge? And do you agree with what Lanxin has said at the beginning? We are already in Cold War territory.
Well, I don't think it's a full Cold War 2.0 yet. I would call it a 1.5 Cold War. But while we're talking about the Cold War analogies, I would encourage both the US and China to re-examine the Cold War toolkit, you might say. The Cold War was certainly a confrontational situation between the West and the former Soviet Union, but please recall the phase of détente, okay? We talked at the beginning about, or I did, about guardrails and buffers, and Lanxin said there's no guardrails and buffers. Well, in the US-China relationship today, I would suggest that we need to kind of revisit what the West Europeans and the Americans did with the former Soviet Union, with the CSCE, the Conference on Security Cooperation in Europe, with the Helsinki Act, with the Ostpolitik strategy of Germany, of a number of confidence building measures, we would call them, conflict de-escalation measures, crisis management measures. There's a whole toolkit of things that the Americans and NATO had with the former Warsaw Pact and Soviet Union. I think it's worth opening that toolkit again. And that's what I had in mind when I was suggesting at the beginning that we need to learn how to contain these frictions between the US and China. We don't have, what's really concerning and really worrying is we don't have those mechanisms in place. So an antagonistic relationship could slide into an adversarial relationship, and a war is not, completely unimaginable because we don't have mechanisms to prevent that. pre-notification of exercises, all kinds of military confidence building measures, they're called, could be agreed between the two sides. But for some reason, and the Americans have been proposing those to the Chinese now since the Obama administration. This is not new. And the Chinese side repeatedly refuses to even have a discussion about these things. They're suspicious for some reason. Well, I don't know, but I would encourage us to look back at Cold War 1.0 and look at some of the stabilizing mechanisms that we were able to put in place then to keep the world from disaster. As for current China-Russia relations, I agree with Lanxin that they're very close. They're the closest they've ever been. Both Putin and Xi Jinping say that publicly. Are the Americans prepared for that? That was your question, Sergio. I don't think the Americans are prepared for it. I don't think the Americans have really been focused on it. I think the Americans, unfortunately, have viewed it as some sort of tactical marriage, but not really a deep, sincere strategic partnership. I study this relationship like Lanxin does. I see a lot more commonality there. There's a depth to the China-Russia relationship today that didn't exist in it previously. So I don't think American strategists and analysts have quite grasped that. Now, you might, just to finish, who does grasp that? Vladimir Putin grasps that. Let me submit, would he be undertaking the incredibly aggressive moves towards Ukraine that he is taking today if he didn't think that China had his back? What if he was a little unclear about China's position? No, he is very clear about China's position. He went to Beijing for the opening of the Olympics. They signed this unprecedented, 20-page document together. Then he ups his pressure on Ukraine, and we don't know where that's going to go. We just saw his statements today about the two so-called independent states. If he's going to invade, my point is, if this China-Russia relationship were not as close as it actually is, he might not be pressuring Ukraine in the way he is. So China is complicit in Russian aggression towards Ukraine, in my view.
Sergio, você está mudo.
Sorry. It's your turn, or maybe we would like to
go to the next question.
Lanxin's reaction to the final statement.
Oh, okay.
I wouldn't make any accusations or in any way because remember Wang Yi Foreign Minister Wang Yi at the Munich conference. He said two things. One is sovereignty is important. China always supports sovereignty, but he also repeats what Xi Jinping and Putin said: NATO enlargement, NATO expansion is the problem. Okay, somehow Western press spin that story into the first part. They don't want to hear the cost. And you see, what's the reason for that? That is where Chinese are sympathetic with Putin, for sure. I have no doubt. You can say there is a Taiwan all over it, written all over this here. We're talking about this. Even though Taiwan is not a sovereign state, nobody really considered Taiwan, as a sovereign state and so on. But that is very clear to the Chinese that NATO expansion. Remember, don't forget another side of NATO. So NATO the last few years become super active in criticizing China as well. Don't forget that part as well. China did not have a NATO problem for a long, long time. I can give you one thing. When I was a science student, I was the only one kicked out of the NATO headquarters. Remember, in Europe, Bologna Center, we have a Bologna Center. We had an organized student visit to NATO headquarters and Brussels, the European Commission and so on. I was the only one kicked out because of the Chinese citizen. I was so totally embarrassed just at the door. They didn't say it at the door. And later on, I was invited to give a regular lecture at the NATO Defense College when I was in Geneva. I thought we don't have a NATO problem at all. I was so you need to understand that NATO enlargement towards Russia is responsible, no matter who make that judgment. I would dispute with that. You say that it's not, there is no responsibility on the Western side to dismiss Russians' security interests. It's, again, in my view, it's a rewriting of a recent history.
Well, let's move to the next question. And then I think I don't know if we have 2 or more questions before we open to the audience. I'd like just to move to Asia. And Asia is most of the hotspots now on the China-US relationship are in Asia. And the possible war between the countries, I think the source is also in Asia. Now we are talking about Taiwan, but you have also the South China Sea. Could you each describe the strategic ambition of the United States and of China to the region and how they clash with each other?
Want me to start, or Lanxin?
No, you go first, David.
Go first, David.
You go first.
Well, I would list America's priorities for Asia as the following. First, no regional dominance by a competitive rival. Second, sustaining and strengthening the post-World War II security architecture, which is based on the 5 alliances the United States has in the region, plus a number of non-allied but very close strategic partnerships, by which I mean Vietnam, India, and Singapore, in addition to the 5 allies, Japan, South Korea, Australia, Philippines, and Thailand. So sustaining that, we call it an architecture. Freedom of navigation and respect for the UN law of the sea, a strong and unified ASEAN, Association for Southeast Asian Nations, a regionally engaged Japan and South Korea, as well as Australia and India. In other words, we want these 4 countries, South Korea, Japan, Australia, India, to become really strong regional actors in their own right. We've always wanted peace across the Taiwan Strait with no coercion by the mainland against Taiwan. We want an unthreatening China to its neighbors. We want an open regional economy, and we want all countries in Asia to respect universal human rights. So if I were to give a list of what the American, if your question was, what are the American priorities for Asia? I would start with those. You can read the most recent Indo-Pacific strategy document the Biden administration has put out. They've got their own view, but that's my list. Great.
Lanxin, what is the Chinese view for Asia?
Well, Chinese narrative, of course, is completely opposite. Okay? I'm talking about Chinese narrative, not necessarily everything I think is the case. Okay. First of all, I think the Chinese, what Chinese want, this is my view, by the way. Then I talk about Chinese narrative. My own view is on South China Sea, for a long time, Chinese prefer let sleeping dogs lie, to use that expression, if you will. They rather, they are rather happy to have ASEAN in the driving seat, ASEAN Regional Forum. They do it slowly, maybe dragging on for many, many years. In the end, maybe something is going to happen. They don't want what Chinese would call outsiders coming in. Here, outsiders meaning the United States. Now, I'm not saying US is not Pacific power. United States is a leading Pacific power, but United States never made a position, okay, on these island disputes. Now, therefore, here is the Chinese narrative. What's happening? Chinese even have a deadline here, right? What is the turning point of this drastic change of Chinese policy, they would put that date April 2010, because that's the Hanoi Foreign Minister Conference. At that conference, as you recall, Hillary Clinton somehow, well, say secretly rallied some ASEAN members, launched a major attack on China on these things. Chinese, of course, also lost temper. I believe Mr. Yang Jiechi certainly are undiplomatic in that case, if not as irritated as in Alaska, but it's certainly in that category of anger. Okay, especially criticizing Singapore. Now, but the point is not Chinese attitude itself. It's a mistake, in my view, diplomatic mistake doing that. Yeah, outburst. But the point is this. The point is, since Nixon, Kissinger time, usually when the United States doing some major policy changes relating to China, okay, there is a kind of tacit understanding. They somehow will indicate to Chinese beforehand. That's the normal, at least what Chinese understood to be a kind of tacit thing. It's not legal or anything, but that one is designed as a Pearl Harbor of diplomacy from a Chinese point of view. Okay, it's a secret diplomacy, and then Chinese was taken completely by surprise, and they began to think United States is going to take a fully designed strategy of using the Southeast Asian issue as a broader containment strategy, which at that time it is called a pivot to Asia. Chinese have, they are not sure pivot to Asia is it's a containment strategy or not. But since that time, it's become very clear that is a containment, including military containment. Did the Chinese overreact? That's my view. Yes, eventually they overreacted to a lot of other things, artificial islands and so on, which seems to me make not too much strategic sense in that area. There are many other issues, but they were unsettled. They were put in a position they believe they were cheated on. Okay, so here the issue about freedom of navigation. I always debate with American colleagues. Every time Americans say we want to protect freedom of navigation of that sea lane, don't forget this is a life bloodline of Chinese economic activities outside the world. There is absolutely no possibility or motivation on Chinese side actually somehow to block that South China Sea, that sea lane all the way into Strait of Malacca. Unthinkable. I never heard anyone, including our Navy people, my admiral friends, ever even think about we should cut our own bloodline just for some crazy reasons, just doing that. So it's not an issue of freedom of navigation, no matter what you define. Okay.
Before we move to the last question, we are already interspersing questions coming from the public with questions that were written by Cláudia. But before we move to the last question that will land us in Latin America, let me ask you both. You especially Lanxin, you've described a pretty gloomy situation, right? U.S. and in China talking past each other, the U.S. having hysterical reaction to the prospect of being a declining partner. My question to both of you: what can change that, right? For instance, Henrique Moraes, who is someone who is attending the meeting, watching us talking here, asked about the role that corporations can play in the U.S. in terms of opening up channels of communications, changing government position, and so on and so forth. Lanxin, it's more difficult to see things in China, right, for obvious reasons. The US, for all its defects, is much more transparent country than China. But what do you see as an insider that might change the tone of the conversation between the two giants?
At this moment, it's almost impossible. Before I talk about China,
I'm getting worried, Lanxin.
No, well, I couldn't sleep. I couldn't sleep. I lost a lot of sleep since I came to this town for one reason, because I'm in this town. I began to realize China policy, what everybody's talking about, or even congressional people talk to me, or politicians talk to me, they always say, China has to be careful because we have bipartisan consensus. Now, they use it as a kind of rhetorical leverage, try to convey the message to China, if you don't take this seriously, you will be in bigger trouble. Now, that doesn't sell. I put this a very simple reason. Because United States, for the first time since the Civil War, it's on the verge of a major domestic split. China issue is the only issue, if I'm not wrong, major issue, I'm talking not small issue, major issue that enjoys bipartisan consensus, meaning American politics it's in a real desperate situation here. Now, if you imagine Chinese leadership in Beijing did not see that, it's a total mistake. Are we going to wait until the midterm election? If I were Xi Jinping or Xi Jinping advisor, I would say the same thing to them. Why should we have a serious dialogue where it's meaningless because everybody's imprisoned by their own domestic politics? China too, by the way. China is the same situation because they fanned up nationalism the last few years. As you know, something called wolf warrior diplomacy. I was on record being the leading critic. David knows I have this long critique of wolf warrior style of diplomacy. I think it's stupid, makes no sense. It's makes Chinese image even worse. But the point is that they are in trouble. Leadership also imprisoned by something they unleash, which is extreme version nationalism. Look at the newspaper called Global Times in China. Okay, I was a major contributor in the past as a columnist. I wrote probably more than 100 pieces for them. I'm the only academic, by the way, who are designated. They call it special columnist for them. I decided to quit because it's enough is enough. I publicly call it Stürmer. Sorry to say, I call editor-in-chief Mr. Hu. Now, Stürmer is the tabloid in the 1930s in Germany, edited by somebody called Julius Steicher. I actually call Wu Xijing and Mr. Steicher second. I couldn't stand it. But the problem is they unleash something they cannot put back genies out of. I always say to the Chinese, whoever willing to listen to me, nationalism is a tiger. It may take you run faster, right? Faster than a horse, but the tiger can hurt you badly. So both sides are imprisoned by domestic politics. In the American sense, also a racial war here, even worse. I hate to say, I mean, this is something Chinese are not quite familiar with. We had the Xinjiang, Tibet, come on, but that's not the same issue, right? Black Lives Matter and all that stuff. So who is the lame duck here? I put very simple way. From a leadership point of view, or from a neutral perspective, which regime is a lame duck? Probably it's not Xi Jinping. Okay.
Okay, we are.
Your take, David. I mean, I think you are entitled to make your observations about the internal dynamics of the Chinese elite, since Lanxin has made comments on Republican Democratic dynamics inside domestic U.S. politics.
Well, I learned long ago that the Chinese do not like interference in internal affairs. So I'm not going to comment on Chinese domestic politics, but I will make two observations on what Lanxin just said. One, I completely agree with him about, and that is the tiger, if you will, of Chinese nationalism. It's very dangerous. It's out of control, and it's can lead the country into a number of very difficult situations with many countries, not just the United States, but with its neighbors in Asia. I think this is a variable. It may be out of control of the regime too, as Lanxin suggests. They've created a Frankenstein, the regime has, with Chinese nationalism. It's an interactive relationship, between the party and the public with regard to nationalism, but it's very, very concerning. And it's driving more than wolf warrior public diplomacy. So, I'm concerned about that. So he and I share that view. I would echo his worries. I don't echo his concerns about American decline. So I've been studying Chinese perceptions of the United States for over 4 decades. I wrote my PhD dissertation more than 40 years ago on Chinese perceptions of America. They were predicting American decline then, and they have never stopped predicting American decline. Yes, the Americans are having some real difficulties at present and in recent years. I'm not sure I would use the word decline necessarily to describe them. There are real serious difficulties. We're grappling with them, in many different spheres. We don't have time to go into all those spheres, but I would just say that the United States has not collapsed at all, and it's not going to collapse. It has a tremendous capacity for rejuvenation, innovation, and it is still a global superpower in all dimensions. I would not say that China is a global superpower. It is in one dimension, economic. I wrote, a book last time when I first went to Brazil. I was researching my book, China Goes Global, the subtitle of which was The Partial Power. And there are many elements of power. There's military power, there's soft power, there's economic power, there's technological power, there's political power, there's diplomatic power. And I would still argue today that China is a uneven power. So the United States has its troubles. We are open to admitting them. We talk about them publicly. We wrestle with them. That's what democracies do. I don't see the Chinese side wrestling with and admitting and coping with the many domestic problems that exist in that country. So I find this whole debate about America in decline, the West in decline and the East is rising. I think it's a bunch of nonsense. And I don't think it's very helpful.
Well, we could talk about that for hours. I'd like to move, David mentioned Brazil. Right now, I'd like to move closer to home. And China is, in the last 20 years, emerged as a crucial trading partner and as a source of investment in Latin America, especially in South America. And in the case of Brazil, last year, 32% of Brazilian exports went to China. And we are in a region of traditional influence of the United States. We are in the same continent. So what are the risks? And this is a question that was presented also from Marcio Domingues. What are the risks for the countries in the region that depend more and more economically on China if this competition increases, and in particularly Brazil? David.
Well, I am not an economist, but if I look around the world at other countries who are highly economically dependent on China, they're not in a very good place. So my suggestion to Brazil and other countries in the Southern Cone is that you diversify your portfolio, so to speak. You diversify your trade, you diversify your exports, not just northward to the United States, but to Europe and to other Asia Pacific countries and within the Southern Cone. There are real dangers to becoming overly dependent on trade and economic relations more broadly with China. So I'm aware of that. There's a very interesting article in The Economist this past week about Bolsonaro and about Brazil's relations, trade relations and otherwise. You have very poor, as I understand it, the relationship between Brazil and China today is not good under the Bolsonaro government. The economic relationship may be strong, but the rest of the relationship is not very positive, is my impression. Well, welcome to the club. Every country in the world has this kind of ambivalence about China. Economic dependence on the one hand, and deep ambivalence and problems on the other hand, with respect to politics, security, human rights, and territorial issues in the case of Asian countries. So, I think all of Latin America is going to find itself in the same place that Southeast Asia has found itself in recent years, trying to what is called hedge, trying to lower its dependence on China, its economic dependence, not increase it, and to balance that dependency with linkages, economic and otherwise, with other partners. The more partners that you have in Brazil, the better off you're going to be. You get too close and in bed with China, you got trouble, big trouble ahead.
Okay, yeah, it's hard to find a country that would match the Chinese demand. I think that is the big issue. Lanxin, how do you see the risks for the countries that are caught in this crossfire?
The risks and the opportunities, Lanxin.
Well, let me just make one clarification what David said, criticism of decline is. I'm actually a leading author who says Chinese leadership should not bank on decline concept at all. I'm on record of saying that, especially not bank on that for making policy. That would be stupid. Again, we are on the same page on that. Even though I like Paul Kennedy's argument about the decline, that's a relative decline. That argument makes some sense, but not absolute thing. Now, the question about the China-Brazil, China-Latin American relationship. Well, first of all, Latin America for China is something new. I used to say before, maybe less than 20 years ago, Chinese know very little about Brazil. The only thing Chinese people grew up reading, like me, is Giorgio Amato, which everybody reads Giorgio Amato. Nothing else. Okay, but I recall I was shocked because when I was a Kissinger chair at the Library of Congress, Fernando Hickey's next door to me, we were together. I remember one shock at that time. He told me, we were colleagues for a year. He said Brazilians even making small airplanes or something like that. I thought that's not possible. I mean, come on, they opened. They're doing the Brazilians actually at that time is already quite active in manufacturing with China. So the issue with Brazil is not entirely the question of Chinese buying raw material and just selling manufacturing goods. Even though China had quite a sizable market for automobile, as far as I know, and there's something else. The relationship so far, if I observe China, Brazilian trade relationship, investment relationship, so far so good. I haven't seen, now depending on which perspective you look at it. Okay? From American perspective, they're always telling me that Monroe Doctrine is dead because of China, but Monroe Doctrine is dead because of the local leaders. It's very little to do with China. American influence, if American influence decline, there has to do with the local leaders accepting the Chinese economic activities. Argentina being a very, very interesting example. Okay, Look at recent movement between Argentina and China. So this is, I think, so far, Chinese strategy in Latin America, in my view, is more successful than they even have with Africa or Central Asia, many other places. Somehow it worked reasonably well compared with all the other parts of the Belt and Road project. Basically because the political relationship is stable, not always good, it's just stable. Okay.
I'm afraid, Claudia, we've ran out of time. We've run out of time, so I think why we don't ask them, the two of them, to do their concluding remarks, and then we close. What about that? Is that okay?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I think we covered a lot of ground. So you go first, David, and then Lanxin.
Okay, don't have any prepared concluding remarks. I think it's been a really interesting discussion. It's been a good opportunity for all of those who have tuned in today to the discussion to see the different ways that Americans and Chinese think about things. I'm not sure how to classify Lanxin. I mean, yes, he's from China, but he's lived outside of China for 5 decades. So when he speaks on behalf of China, I'm a little unclear if he's speaking, on behalf of the Chinese government. He lives in Switzerland. He's now in the United States. Anyway, I think nonetheless, the kind of discussion, we haven't really had a debate, but the kind of discussion and the differences in our views have been a good example for those who are watching today and listening today of the differences of viewpoint, between the United States and China. And that's a reality, as I said at the beginning. This is the new normal differences between the US and China. It's going to have collateral impacts on all other countries all over the world, every region of the world, including in the Southern Cone and in South America. So, this is navigating that competition between the United States and China is not easy for other countries. I get it. But, it's like when you invest in the stock market, the best strategy is diversification, right? You hope you pick good stocks, but you need diversification in case some of your stocks don't go so well. So my only concluding observation is for Brazil and other countries to diversify your portfolio, not just between the US and China, but within the Southern Cone, with the EU, with other APEC members, other countries. And by the way, ASEAN, Southeast Asia, is the world's 5th largest collective economy. Very dynamic countries there. India, very dynamic. Japan, very dynamic. South Korea, very dynamic. Thailand, Malaysia, Australia. So China is not the only option, ladies and gentlemen. So I would just encourage, if you become too dependent on China, that's not a good investment strategy.
Lanxin.
Oh, let me say David, come on. I'm always speaking my own mind. I criticize China. I criticize many countries, including United States. But my coherent view, if you really want to figure out what I'm thinking, you have to, I'm not doing advertisement, to read my 2019 book. That I have everything there. That's little book, 160 pages. It took me almost 13 years to do it. So that's my thing.
The book
it's
about
called
the
legitimacy. Yes.
in Chinese
yes.
political code.
I just want to summarize the fundamental theme I have in that book. What I'm trying to say, the West is wrong to assume China's legitimacy problems only comes from lack of democracy. Okay, that's wrong. Has not historical, sustainable. Chinese traditional system has its own merits, It's been vilified for quite a couple of centuries since the Jesuits. Now it's time to restore that reputation. I'm not even talking about communists. Secondly, is China facing legitimacy crisis today? And the answer is yes, but it's not what you think the reason. What I'm trying to say, the real problem is the leadership trying to revive tradition, which is clear. That's what China dream, they're talking about restauration. The concept rise of China is always Western nonsense. Chinese don't use that term. They say restoration, right? Or you can say re-rise. I would prefer that term. Never use the term rise as if it's something new. We have seen the movie before. Okay, we've been the top financial power and the trading power before. So we are going back to history. Okay, the West are not interested in going back to history. That's where the conversation cannot be going. So I suggest in my book is that Chinese leader try to restore tradition. At the same time, they are unwilling to reform a system which is not traditional system. Okay, I call it Bolshevik, but also I'm basically saying it's an alien thing, no matter what you say. It's not a native Chinese system. Therefore, you have a contradiction there. Unless you go with the idea, I will never restore tradition, because tradition is powerful in China. Tradition will win. So that is my view. Yes.
I mean, this is a subject that I think deserves a discussion of its own. Let me make the invitation, Lanxin, that we can address your book in a specific webinar. Let me thank you both for the candor of your conversation here. It was enlightening on the one hand, and frankly speaking, a little bit scary on the other. But anyway, thank you for the candor. And Cláudia, I turn to you to say goodbye.
Okay. On behalf of the Conselho Empresarial Brasil-China, I'd like to thank David and Lanxin and Sergio and Fundação Fernando Henrique Cardoso for the partnership. I think it was a terrific discussion. I think that we received many interesting questions from the audience, and we would need 3 hours more to address everything. But I think we, in the time we're together, it was a very productive discussion. Thank you so much.
Very interesting one. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Obrigado. Obrigado.
Take care. Take care. And
Take care.
I mean, just one last message.
Okay.
I hope you manage the competition well, because
I
believe
hope
me,
so.
guys, you can do a lot of collateral damage in the world.
You bet. You bet.
All right. Bye-bye.
We're working on it.
We're
Okay,
working.
thank
We're
you.
working on it. We need some kind of interlocutor, on both sides. Yes.
All right. You can
All
count
right.
on us. You can count
Okay.
on us.
Okay. Okay.
Okay.
Ciao.
Bye-bye.
Ciao. Ciao. Bye. Bye.
Ciao.
Bye.
Ciao. Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.